Welcome to the first lesson on advanced HTML. And the first thing we're going to learn about is the document object model, or what I'm going to call the DOM. Now, the document object model is basically your hierarchy of how a browser understands what is in your page and where it exists. Now, what I mean by that is think of, it's like a tree map. So you sort of have your starting point up here, and then you might have like a block here and a block here, and then you might have a block here and here, and then one over here and here, and those might have some blocks and maybe some text inside of each block. All of that is considered the document object model. So the document object model, how would I describe this? Every piece of HTML, every element that you write is an object. And so it has specific attributes and specific methods that can be taken on it. So when we eventually get to JavaScript, after you learn HTML and then CSS and then JavaScript in that order, once you get to JavaScript, you'll actually be able to modify the DOM dynamically. So you'll be able to change all of your HTML elements and the attributes and the text and everything in there. It is completely fluid. And the document object model is sort of the brain behind keeping track of all of that. So what I would like us to do is just explore the document object model. So all I'm going to do here is open up a new tab in my browser, and I'm going to go to google.com, and we are just going to explore some of the different document object models out there through various images. And then we're going to explore one that we've actually already written. So go to google.com, and then where is images? Where is images? Click on images. And we're going to do an image search for document object model. And here we can see what looks like a bunch of graphs. And so let's look for one that looks somewhat nice and representable. We've got tables. We don't want tables. Let's do this one. Nope, let's not do that one. That's not really a good one. Let's go ahead, copy that image location and paste that in there. Here we go. We've got a DOM, and this is just from images.slideplayer.com. Not my image, just as a declaration out there. I did not make this, but the document object model is basically a document. And then we've got a root element, our HTML, which is why we always add HTML to our documents. And then we have our element head. And in that head, we have a title and a bunch of other attributes. We've only ever seen title so far. And then in the body, we might have a link, we might have an H1, we might have a paragraph, we might have a table, we might have a div. And then inside of that div, we might have an H1. And inside of that H1, we might have a link. And so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, typically, the head is not very big. And a good example of this is from our last lesson with tables, we can see that I have over 70 lines of code, and let's say 74 up into line 7. So about 65 lines of code is all the body. And the only thing I have in the head is one line, just a title. So right now it's like a 1 to 65-ish ratio. And so this document object model, basically you have a very shallow head and you have a very large body, and that's totally normal. And then inside of each element, you have particular text. So like inside of the title, we have my title. In this image, or in the tables one, we have, what do we have in there? It's just called tables. So we have text in there, and that's just called a text node. Let's go ahead and take a look for another example. Do we have a bigger one in here? Let's go ahead and type, I don't know, large document object model. Let's copy that image location and let's open that up as well. So in here we have a document, which is our HTML. This would be our HTML element. And then somewhere inside of the body, we have elements, we've got comments, and we've got processing instructions. But basically we just want to follow this straight down. We've got our HTML, and then we've got like some sort of body, and then maybe we have a div. And maybe that div has an attribute. Maybe that attribute is a title, and that title has a particular text value. So this whole mapping is part of the document object model. Now, explaining this in images is honestly not doing it justice. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to refresh this page. And I'm on tables.html, which you have access to. In order to get to this document object model, let's inspect this element. So right click, inspect. And we are going to see all sorts of stuff in here. So we have The doc type is HTML, so we're telling the page that this particular document object model should follow HTML5 standards. Inside of this, we have HTML. It's the only HTML element that we have, and everything goes inside of it. Now, inside of HTML, we have two elements. We have head and body. Head is where all the knowledge of your page goes, so your page title, meta descriptions, which we'll cover later, linking to CSS, which we'll cover later, maybe JavaScript, again, we'll cover that a little bit later. Sort of the information, the metadata about the page goes inside of the head. And inside of the body is everything visual, everything that you can interact with. So inside of our head, we have one element, and this is a title. So you could say that our most parent element is the HTML element. And then it has a child element called head. And that head element has a child page or a grandchild page in relation to the HTML called title. And it has text in there that we can change at any time. And you can see that that took place up here. And so anytime you make a change to your document object model inside of your inspector, it's also going to reflect that change on your page. So let's close up the head and let's look at the body. This is going to be much more complicated. So in the body, we have three elements. So we've got three children in here, three child elements from the body element. We have our first table. We've got a horizontal rule. That's just a line that goes across the page. And then we've got a larger table underneath it, which has 16, 20, 24 cells. So 6 rows, 4 across, 6 times 4 is 24. Although we can't necessarily see that because we've been merging some of these together. But if we look at our first table, this top one here, this has one element. And in fact, we actually didn't write this. We cheated in that last video. We did not give it a T-body, but the document object model said, oh, there was no T-body specified. Okay, well, this is going to be in a T-body. So it actually modified the hierarchy of our page for us. Inside of that T-body is a table row. We've got 4 of them. And inside of that first table row, we have 4 TH, table heads, or basically they're table cells that are text align centered and bold. And we have 4 of those. And then in each one, we have some text. And watch this change right up here. Some text. So we close that one up and we have the next one. So the next one has 4 elements in it. And the next row has 3 elements, and the next row has 3 elements. And this goes on and on and on and on and on. And this table actually has a specific T-head, T-body, and T-foot. So if we go into like the T-head, we can see that there's a table row in here. You can actually see what it looks like when I hover over it. Then we've got T-head, column 1, 2, 3, and 4 in here. And then when we go into the footer, we're basically going to see the same thing. Footer title 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so this creates a structure where everything is nested underneath something else. So everything is going to live inside of your HTML. Then you've got head or body. And if it's in the body, you're going to have some sort of element. And inside of that element, you might have another element. And inside of that one, you might have another element. And then maybe you just have some text in there. Maybe it's just an image. Maybe there's no text and it just ends with a particular element. This whole thing creates the document object model. Now, you're probably thinking, why is this important? This is important when you get into CSS because you need to know about nesting and how to select certain elements so you can style them a certain way. But it's actually even more important when you eventually get to JavaScript. So you'll learn HTML first and then CSS and then JavaScript. You'll learn how all of these sort of get modified, different, doing air quotes here, methods. There's different functions for modifying everything on the page. Now, when you load a page, this is what your browser initially sees. It is a bunch of code that looks like this. And when it reads that, it says, okay, the doc type is HTML, so I'm going to parse it as HTML. I'm going to break it apart and understand it as HTML. And when we look in our first table, it's table and then 4 TRs. But when we look at the first table in our document object model, that's part of the inspector here, we can actually see that there's a T body. And so our browser said, what you wrote was not good enough. And so I'm going to put all of this inside of one more element called a T body, just to keep things nice and standardized. And then with CSS or JavaScript, should you ever want to just select the particular body of a table. So let's say in our second table here, we have a head, a body, and a foot. Maybe you just want to select something in the body, you can do just that. Or if you want to grab just the head and then hit delete, you can do that too. And let's delete the footer. And now we just have a table with rows in it, no header, no footer. CSS and JavaScript can help you with all this sort of interaction. And the document object model, all of this magic behind here, is what keeps track of all of the changes for you. So it takes your initial payload, whatever your server or your page is loading, all this HTML. It takes all of that, renders it into proper HTML. Your browser says, okay, I'm a math machine. I'm going to understand how all of this works and fix it up to the best of my ability, which it does. And then you can take action on that. So it's a nice way of standardizing everything. That is your document object model. Now, you don't need to know too much about that with HTML. And I'm sort of just throwing it into the HTML course because I know from experience that a lot of CSS courses and a lot of JavaScript courses do not tell you what a document object model is. They just assume that you know what it is and they call it a DOM. And you're like, what's a DOM? And the DOM is introduced when you start writing HTML. So we're learning about it now. Now I have one small task for you in this one. What I would like you to do, hop on the good old Google machines and just type in document object model. And just look through some different images. Let's put in DOM. Oh, here's a good one. I should have just wrote DOM. You could put DOM or document object model, and you could take a look at something like this, where you've got like your core, maybe XML, HTML. That one's actually not super great. This one's better. You've got HTML, and then you have head and title and body, paragraph, list items, first, second, all sorts of stuff like that. Just take a look at different DOMs. Just sort of try to understand how this works and how it relates to the code we've already been writing. Once you are done with that, you have a pretty good understanding of how that works, or you just get a little too bored and you just want to move on to the next lesson. That's cool too. I'll meet you over at the next one, and we are going to learn about XHTML, and we've actually already seen some of this, and we're going to learn the difference between HTML and XHTML.